The Sea of Galilee, usually a mirror of the sky, had just been the stage for a terrifying display of nature's wrath. Only hours before, a sudden and violent squall had threatened to tear the small wooden fishing boat apart. The disciples, seasoned fishermen who knew the temperament of these waters intimately, had been paralyzed by the fear of death. Yet the true marvel was not the storm, but the man who had slept through it, and the words he spoke to end it. With a mere whisper of, "Peace, be still," Jesus of Nazareth had commanded the wind and the waves, and they had obeyed. Now, a profound, almost unnatural stillness lay over the water. The sky was the deep, bruised purple of early dawn. The boat glided silently toward the eastern shore, moving away from the familiar Jewish territories of Galilee and toward the region of the Gerasenes, a Gentile land known as the Decapolis. Here, the culture was Greek, the customs were foreign, and the spiritual atmosphere felt heavy, dark, and unwelcoming. As the bow of the boat scraped against the gravel of the shoreline, the disciples breathed a sigh of relief, though it was short-lived. They had survived the chaos of the physical elements, but they were entirely unaware that they were stepping directly onto the battlefield of a far more terrifying, unseen war. The physical storm had been silenced. The spiritual storm was about to begin. The region of the Gerasenes was defined by its steep, jagged cliffs that plunged abruptly toward the sea. Carved into the limestone of these hillsides were hundreds of dark, gaping holes, natural caves that the locals had repurposed as tombs for the dead. It was a place of mourning, a place of decay, and according to the laws of the men in the boat, a place of utter ritual impurity. Peter, James, and John were the first to step out of the boat, their sandals crunching against the wet stones. A chilling wind swept down from the cliffs, carrying with it the faint, metallic scent of the sea, mingled with the cold, damp odor of the tombs. There were no welcoming committees here, no crowds of desperate sick seeking healing, no religious leaders waiting to debate theology. There was only an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on their chests. Jesus stepped ashore last. His face was calm, his eyes fixed on the dark mouths of the caves above them. He did not look like a man who had just conquered a hurricane, nor did he look like a man stepping into enemy territory. He looked like a shepherd who had intentionally crossed a treacherous valley to find a single, specific lost sheep. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. It was not the cry of a wild animal, though it held a feral, inhuman quality. It was a long, agonizing shriek that echoed off the cliff faces, a sound of absolute torment that made the blood of the disciples run cold. From the shadows of the highest tombs, a figure emerged, moving with a terrifying, unnatural speed down the rocky descent toward the shore. To call the approaching figure a man felt like a disservice to humanity. He was a portrait of total devastation. For years, this unnamed soul had been the terror of the local towns. He lived among the decaying corpses, an outcast driven away by the fears of his own people. The townspeople had tried to help him, or at least they had tried to contain him. Time and time again, they had formed posses, hunting him down in the hills, binding his hands and feet with heavy iron chains and shackles. But ordinary iron was no match for the supernatural fury that possessed him. With strength that defied human anatomy, he would snap the chains like brittle twigs and shatter the shackles on the rocks. Stripped of his clothing, stripped of his dignity, and stripped of his mind, he roamed the hills day and night. The disciples, now clutching the sides of the boat in terror, could see him clearly as he closed the distance. His skin was leathered by the harsh sun and covered in a tapestry of old scars and fresh, bleeding wounds. In his moments of extreme agony, driven by the dark entities that hijacked his consciousness, he would take sharp, jagged stones and slash his own flesh, howling his pain into the empty sky. He was entirely alone, yet he was completely occupied. He was a prisoner in his own body,
a hostage to a darkness so profound that his own voice was no longer his own. As he charged toward the shoreline, kicking up dust and loose rocks, the disciples instinctively backed away, some reaching for the oars to push the boat back into the safety of the water. But Jesus did not move. He stood perfectly still, a solitary pillar of light against the encroaching darkness.
The possessed man closed the final few yards at a dead sprint. The disciples braced themselves for a violent collision, expecting the man to tear their master apart with his bare hands. But then, an extraordinary thing happened. Less than 10 feet from Jesus, the man's legs gave out. The feral, murderous momentum evaporated in an instant. He did not attack. He collapsed. His knees slammed into the sharp gravel, and his face bowed low to the earth, pressing against the very stones at Jesus' feet. It was not a bow of reverence or love. It was a bow of absolute, compelled submission. The darkness within him had recognized the light. The creations of chaos had recognized the creator of order. A voice tore from the man's throat, a voice that was guttural, layered, and resonating with an ancient malice. It did not sound like one man speaking. It sounded like a chorus of overlapping whispers and shouts. "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" the voice shrieked. "In God's name, I beg you, do not torture me!" The disciples stared in stunned silence. The demons, operating through the vocal cords of the broken man, had identified Jesus instantly. The religious leaders in Jerusalem were still debating whether Jesus was a prophet or a fraud. The disciples in the boat were still wondering, who is this, that even the wind and waves obey him? But the forces of darkness harbored no such doubts. They knew exactly who stood before them, the Son of the Most High. Jesus looked down at the trembling, bleeding figure. His expression was not one of disgust, but of commanding authority, mixed with a deep, sorrowful pity for the human vessel trapped beneath the spiritual debris. Jesus spoke, his voice cutting through the chill morning air with absolute sovereignty. "Come out of this man, you impure spirit!" The man convulsed on the ground, his fingers digging frantically into the sand. The demons were resisting, clinging desperately to the host they had tormented for years. The sheer concentration of evil within the man was staggering. To reveal the scale of the spiritual infestation to his disciples, and to assert total dominion over the entities, Jesus asked a question. It was not asked out of ignorance, but as a judicial command from a king demanding the identity of an invading force. "What is your name?" Jesus asked. The man lifted his head, his eyes rolling back, revealing the whites. The voice that emerged was boastful, yet laced with an undeniable undercurrent of absolute terror. "My name is Legion," the voice replied, echoing with a chilling multiplicity. "For we are many." A Roman legion consisted of up to 6,000 heavily armed soldiers, a terrifying, unstoppable force of destruction and occupation. By adopting this name, the spirits were boasting of their overwhelming numbers and their coordinated destructive power. They had garrisoned this man's soul. They had occupied his mind. They were an army of darkness residing within a single human being. But standing before the commander of heaven's armies, this legion was reduced to begging. The demons knew their time was up. They knew they could not withstand the command of Christ. But they were terrified of their ultimate fate. Through the man's mouth, they pleaded with Jesus repeatedly, begging him not to order them to go into the abyss, the bottomless pit, the realm of ultimate confinement and judgment for fallen spirits. As the standoff continued on the shoreline, the rising sun began to illuminate the hillsides above. About a mile away, spread across a steep, grassy incline, a massive herd of pigs was feeding. There were roughly 2,000 of them, a valuable economic asset to the Gentiles who owned them, tended to by a group of local swineherds. The demons, desperate to avoid the abyss and seeking a physical host to satisfy their destructive nature, saw the herd. "Send us among the pigs," the legion begged. "Allow us to go into them." Jesus, in his unsearchable wisdom, granted their request. With a single word, he permitted the transfer, demonstrating both the destructive reality of evil and the supreme value of one human soul over any amount of material wealth. "Go," Jesus commanded. Immediately, the man on the ground stopped convulsing. A profound silence fell over him as he gasped for air, the heavy, suffocating weight of 1,000 shadows instantly lifting from his chest. But up on the hillside, pure chaos erupted. The transfer was instantaneous. The massive herd of 2,000 pigs suddenly stopped feeding. A collective shudder went through the animals. Then, madness took hold. The pigs began to squeal in terror, a deafening, horrific cacophony that drowned out the sound of the crashing waves. Driven by the violent, self-destructive nature of the demons that now possessed them, the entire herd turned as one. They did not scatter. They surged forward like a singular, possessed organism, stampeding directly toward the edge of the steep cliff. The swineherds watched in frozen horror as their livelihood, a fortune in livestock, threw themselves over the precipice. A waterfall of bodies plummeted down the jagged rocks, hitting the deep waters of the Sea of Galilee with massive splashes. Within minutes, 2,000 pigs drowned in the dark waters, dragged down by the sheer weight of the demonic forces that sought only to destroy. The sea swallowed them, and then, slowly, the water grew calm once more.
The swineherds did not wait around. Terrified by the supernatural display of power and panicked by the loss of their massive herd, they fled on foot. They ran into the nearby town and spread out across the countryside, shouting the news to anyone who would listen. They told of the man who commanded spirits and the inexplicable mass suicide of the pigs. Within hours, a large crowd from the city and the surrounding farms made their way to the shore. They came expecting to find devastation. They came expecting to find the wild, screaming madman they had all feared for years. Instead, they found a scene of profound, unbelievable peace. There, sitting quietly at the feet of Jesus, was the man who had been possessed by the legion. The disciples had given him a tunic, and he was clothed. His wounds were no longer bleeding. His eyes, once wild and filled with murderous intent, were calm, clear, and brimming with tears of gratitude. He was entirely in his right mind. The storm within his soul had been silenced, just as the storm on the sea had been. But the reaction of the townspeople was not what one might expect. There was no rejoicing. There was no celebration for the restoration of a lost son, a brother, or a friend. Instead, a deep, overwhelming fear gripped the crowd. They looked at the dead pigs floating in the water, a massive blow to their local economy. They looked at the calm, authoritative face of Jesus. They realized that a power far greater than anything they could comprehend, far greater than the Roman Empire, far greater than the demons they feared, had stepped onto their shores. The light of Christ was too bright for a people accustomed to the dark. They valued their pigs more than they valued the salvation of a human being. They were more comfortable with a predictable, chained monster in the tombs than an unpredictable, sovereign God standing in their presence. The leaders of the town approached Jesus. They did not fall to their knees. They did not ask for healing for their sick. With trembling voices, they begged Jesus to leave their region. They asked the Prince of Peace to depart from their borders. Jesus did not argue. He did not force his presence where it was rejected. He simply turned and began to walk back toward the boat.
As Jesus stepped into the boat and the disciples began to prepare the oars, the healed man ran toward the water. The man who had been alone for so long, who had known nothing but torture and darkness, could not bear the thought of being separated from the one who had saved him. He splashed into the shallow water, grasping the side of the boat,
tears streaming down his face. "Let me go with you," he begged. "Please, Lord, let me follow you." He wanted to be a disciple. He wanted to cross the sea and sit under the teachings of this master. It was a beautiful, desperate plea. But Jesus gently placed a hand on the man's shoulder. He gave him a smile full of warmth and purpose. "No," Jesus said softly. "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." It was a profound and difficult assignment. Jesus was leaving a region that had just rejected him, but he was not leaving them without a witness. He was leaving behind a living, breathing testament to his grace. This man, who had been the embodiment of fear and darkness in the Decapolis, was now commissioned to be its first missionary. The man let go of the boat. He watched as Jesus and the disciples rowed away, the vessel slowly becoming a small speck on the vast Sea of Galilee. He did not mourn. He stood tall, the chains of his past broken forever. He turned away from the tombs, away from the sea, and began walking toward the city. He went through the entire Decapolis, the 10 Gentile cities, telling everyone he met about the man named Jesus, who had stepped into his darkness and commanded the shadows to flee. And all the people were amazed.
The story of the Gerasene Demoniac is not merely a tale of a miraculous exorcism. It is a profound reflection on the human condition and the nature of divine rescue. It presents us with stark, unforgettable contrasts. We see the ultimate devaluation of human life through the possession of the legion, a man stripped of dignity, forced to live among the dead, tearing at his own flesh. The kingdom of darkness seeks only to isolate, torment, and destroy. In contrast, we see the infinite value God places on a single human soul. Jesus crossed a stormy sea, entered hostile, unclean territory, and permitted the destruction of a massive fortune in livestock, all to rescue one man. To Jesus, the restoration of one broken mind and one lost heart was worth more than 2,000 swine. Yet the tragedy of the story lies not with the demons, who knew their place and obeyed, but with the townspeople. They represent the tragedy of the human heart that prefers the familiar, comfortable darkness over the disruptive, transformative light of God. They asked salvation to leave their shores because salvation was bad for business. But grace always leaves a remnant. The man who was told to stay became a beacon of light in a dark region. His life became an undeniable sermon. He was living proof that no one is too far gone, no mind is too shattered, and no soul is too deeply plunged into darkness that the simple, authoritative word of Christ cannot reach them, heal them, and send them forth in peace.